Thank you very much, Professor Santori. I want to say what a great pleasure it is to be back at St. Olaf. I visited here in the late 1980s, had a wonderful time, and it took me a long time to get back, but I'm really glad to be back, and I'm grateful, Ed, for the invitation. Also grateful to Mr. Paulson for the work that he's put in to making tonight's panel possible. And it's a very great honor to be on the panel with Professor Little and Professor Laborde, two scholars of extraordinary achievement and standing. Now, St. Olaf has also been the home of two of my dearest and oldest academic friends. One, someone I hope you're all studying with, Professor Charles Tolliver in the philosophy department, and the other is the great, indeed, legendary Robert Jensen, perhaps the greatest living theologian. Jens now, as we call him, Jens now lives in Princeton, where he is, I regret to report, in hospice care, but I was able to visit him just a few days ago, and while he wasn't able to communicate easily, he was alert and understanding and able to toss in a word or two here or there at just the right moment. But this was a wonderful home for him for so many years, and I know it's a treasure in his heart, and since he's so important to me, you're a treasure in my heart as well, St. Olaf. Now, we have 20 minutes, and I want to stick to that, so I'll... This, by the way, for you youngsters, is a wristwatch. I know you tell time with these things, but this is an old-fashioned thing, but it's of enormous sentimental value to me. This watch means the world to me. This is the watch that my dear, beloved, late grandfather on his deathbed sold me, so I'm never going to give up that, even no matter how advanced they get with these cell phones. I'm sticking with my watch. Now, if I ask my students, as I frequently do at the beginning of my course in civil liberties at Princeton, do you believe in the right to religious freedom? Almost all of them will say, yes, absolutely, Professor. I believe in the right to religious freedom. Good. Now, you believe it really is a right, right? Yeah, absolutely. Really believe it's a right. So my next question will be obvious. Where did it come from? What's the basis of such a right? How would you defend the proposition that there in fact is such a right? And like a shot, the overwhelming majority, it would be the rarest of cases if this weren't the case, the overwhelming majority of students will say, well, we make a deal with each other, a kind of social compact or mutual non-aggression pact. I will respect your religious freedom in return for your respecting my religious freedom. After all, even if I'm now in the position of strength over you, that might not always be the case. And so in order to make sure that when the time comes when our respective strengths are reversed and you're stronger than I am, you will respect my religious freedom. So I agree to respect your religious freedom now. Now, I myself do not think that is a very good argument at all. It's not that it's never it's not that it never has a place, but as an argument for a right to religious freedom, I don't think it works. And there are a variety of reasons for that. One is that why not be a gambler? Why not think, well, look, in the long run we're all dead, but for as far as I can tell, I'm going to be the strong, you're going to be the weak. Why should I respect your religious freedom if it's in my interest or my desire to oppress you? And is it really, after all, even if we do get the agreement, and I think part of the reason students run for this is so often people think, well, we can't have rights that aren't the fruit of some choice or commitment that we have made. But in any event, even if you get people to go for the deal, have you really derived a human right? Is that a human right? Can the fruit of that mutual non-aggression pact or social contract be a right? I don't think so. In my view, to be a right, to be a human right, the right, whether it's a liberty or some other right, has to be connected to, has to protect, has to advance, has to have something to do with an aspect of human well-being and fulfillment, with a good or set of goods protected or advanced by the right. Goods or sets of goods that we have reasons as human beings to favor, support, uphold, try to realize in our actions, participate in, and so forth. But if that's true, if I'm right about that, so just for the sake of argument, assume for a moment that I'm right about that, what good or set of goods could a right to religious freedom protect? Well, I've got a candidate. Now, it's not the only candidate, but I think it's the central one, because the right to religious freedom can protect a number of goods. But I think the central one is a tripartite good. It's a connection of three things that are tightly bound together, which is why I talk about them as one good, like a Trinitarian view of this good. It's the good that for all of us human beings consists in, first, raising the fundamental questions of human existence, the great existential questions of meaning and ultimate value, if any. The questions of transcendence. The question, how did we get here? What are we doing here? What does it all mean? Is there a purpose in life? Do we live in a world of exclusively material and efficient causality, or is there more than that? Is there a transcendent reality? Is there a spiritual realm? Is there a God? If there is, can we be in relationship with God? Can we be in harmony with God? Is there a law higher than the merely human law, under which the merely human law can be judged, under which the merely human law stands in judgment? A law perhaps that would impose on us the obligation to do unto others as we'd have others do unto ourselves, or not. Now, I think that's a question that every human being should ask. Not in some abstract sense of should, but because to have a rich human life, to have a truly human life, you need to ask those questions. And I think you can recognize that whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, whether you're a polytheist or a monotheist, whether you're Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist, you ought to be able to recognize that it's important for people to ask those questions, that it's important for me, myself, whoever I am, to ask those questions. Who, after all, including our famous atheist friends, Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, who would want their children to go through life never addressing those questions, those great existential questions, never wondering about them, never thinking them through or trying to think them through, those great questions of meaning and value, ultimate meaning and value? Nobody would, because we recognize quite easily the importance to our humanity of raising those questions. That's part one. Part two of the tripartite good is the honest effort to answer those questions truthfully. Not to trick oneself or deceive oneself or believe what it's comfortable to believe or believe what other people are believing or believe the things that will get me in good with other people or make me popular or whatever. No, to get the right answers. There's a perfectly good fundamental practical reason to try to get to the truth of the matter. And then the third aspect of this good is trying to live a life of authenticity and integrity in line with one's own best judgments as to whether what the truth of these matters is. Whether it is atheistic or theistic, whether it affirms a transcendent order or a spiritual realm or it doesn't, whether one's answer leads one into Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or Islam or what have you. That, I think, is essential to living a full, truly human life. But for people to do that, to raise the questions, try honestly to answer them, and live with authenticity and integrity in light of one's best judgments about them, and not live the life of a fake, pretending to be a believer if one's not, because it's popular in your culture to go to church. Or you'll get a better job or meet more people who might be able to do good for you if you go to church. Or it could work the other way. If you're a believer, but pretend not to be a believer because, I don't know, you're in a university or something and they don't approve of that. Or you're in the old Soviet Union and it's not good for your job prospects in the future, or your children's job prospects in the future if you're known to be a believer. That kind of inauthenticity is no good for human beings. And in order for people to live lives of authenticity, they need the freedom to do just that. So that, I think, is the basis of the right to religious freedom. Now, what do we call that good? In the end, it doesn't matter how you label it, but one thing you could call that good is the good of religion. But notice that it's religion in a broad sense. The raising of the questions, the honest effort to answer the questions, the effort to live with authenticity and integrity in line with one's best judgments. What's overwhelmingly important is not the label, but the reality of asking the questions, those questions. Now, maybe other important questions. These aren't the only important questions to ask in life, but there are a certain category of questions that are terribly important to ask and to answer as best one can truthfully, and to live with authenticity and integrity in light of one's best answers. And I think once we understand that as the foundation, the basis of religious freedom, we recognize that while it is not an exceptionless principle, it is a principle. It's got to be given presumptive standing. That if we're to do something to impede someone's carrying out the activities you need to do of raising questions, trying honestly to answer them, living with authenticity and integrity in light of one's best answer, to justify that kind of imposition, a high standard has to be met, whether it's by other individuals or by public authority. What should the standard be? Well, I don't have time to do a detailed analysis of this, but I'll say that I think the standard that we have established in our law, initially in our constitutional law in the United States, now statutorily in the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, is a pretty good approximation of where we should be. And some of you will know, for others I'll just spin it out very briefly. The basic idea is this: where a law or policy or action by government impinges negatively on the belief or practice of a citizen, of a person, that law, in order to survive legal scrutiny, must pass a test. And the test is that the government is obligated to show that the application of the law to the person on whom it is an imposition is supported by the highest standard known in our constitutional law, the standard of compelling state interest. You need a really good reason, not just a legitimate governmental interest, but a high governmental interest, something important. And beyond that, the law or policy must represent the least intrusive or least restrictive means of prosecuting that compelling state interest. Now, once again, the language doesn't matter. You could formulate this basic idea in lots of different ways. And there could be permutations and variations of it to make it a little less stringent or a little more stringent. But I think that's right. If we recognize the right to religious freedom based on the foundation that I've just outlined, I think the proper scope of religious freedom, especially when it comes to governmental imposition on religious freedom, is something like what I just outlined, the compelling interest, least restrictive means test. Now notice that test only means that you get a presumption and you get a hearing. Now where that hearing should be, whether it should be in a court, whether it should be in a legislature, who should be granting conduct exemptions, whether we should have a statutory basis for it, whether it should be the way we interpret the First Amendment of the Constitution. If I had an hour and 20 minutes rather than just 20 minutes, I could lead you through some of the considerations in favor and against all of those different proposals. But again, that's less significant. Those are the details. What's significant is the standard. But again, note that the standard doesn't guarantee anybody, including the religious claimant or the atheist, who has as much a right to religious freedom under this theory as anybody else. It doesn't entitle any claimant to a victory. it entitles the claimant to a hearing, and it imposes an obligation on the state to meet certain standards, lest this great human good, whatever we want to call it, this tripartite human good, be damaged and lost in the life of the believer. Now, what kinds of considerations go into compelling state interest? That's a very important question. What do we consider a compelling state interest? How do we assess that? Different people will read that differently. And so I think we have to have as rigorous and civil an argument as we can have on those issues, especially when they come to the most sensitive points, the ones that Professor Santori, raised, like in the area of allegations of discrimination or in the area of the compulsion of services by service providers in the area of abortion and so forth and so on, conscientious objection in war. All of these are sensitive areas where I think we have to have the debate. But in my 20 minutes, really all I want to persuade you of is that that is the debate to have. I don't think it's fruitful to have a debate over a social compact or a mutual non-aggression pact. I think it's much more fruitful to have the debate over what the limits are to religious liberty properly understood, where properly understood means understood as an actual human right, a right that protects actual human goods, actual aspects of our well-being and fulfillment as human beings. If you go the other route, the social compact, mutual non-aggression pact route, then the question of the limits all depends on the deal you can strike. And that, to me, is not a very secure basis for anything that would really qualify as a human right. Thank you.
Professor Laborde.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'd like to thank Professor Santori for the invitation. Like Professor George, I have a watch. I can show it to you. The time he sets is 1:30 a.m., which is the current time in the UK. So I hope you will forgive me for any slowness, which is predictable. Okay, so I want to start by postulating that religious freedom is a basic freedom in a liberal society. So how is it justified? So my standpoint is that of a liberal political philosophy standpoint. So from Rawls, I draw the idea that religious freedom is grounded in a more general value, which we might want to call moral or ethical independence. So Rawls thought that the liberal state must protect people's ability to form, revise, and live by their own conception of the good life. And I would add something: the liberal state should protect people's ability to live with integrity. So what I mean by integrity is the fact that my actions have to cohere with the way I think I ought to live. So, for example, I ought to be able to live in accordance with my conscience. So I think this focus on integrity is important, because if you take a standard Rawlsian line, you might think that what really matters is that the law shouldn't deliberately restrict or penalize religious practice. But I think we need to be more than this. We also need to say that the law sometimes shouldn't incidentally, so not deliberately, but incidentally burden religious practice. And this is, I think, is the rationale for exemptions from otherwise legitimate general laws on grounds of conscience. So one example would be cases where Catholic physicians ought not to be forced to perform, say, abortions if it goes against their conscience. as Professor George just said, the fact that a religious claim counts as a pro tanto claim doesn't mean that it should be granted. So there's going to be a range of factors that we can discuss as to whether this or that particular claim should be granted. So it will depend on the importance of the law in question, whether the objective of the law can be pursued through less restrictive means, the protections of the rights of others and third-party harms, etc. But still, I want to insist that it is a claim of religious freedom. So I disagree with other liberals, such as, for example, Ronnie Dworkin or Brian Leiter, who claim that you can't really distinguish a religious claim from a mere preference. And I disagree with that. I think you can and you should. I think there's a special value in doing what you think you ought to do instead of pursuing a mere preference. So that's the special value I call the value of ethical integrity. Okay, so how do we test ethical integrity? So I want to suggest, probably won't have time to develop it, but the only test you need really is a test of sincerity. You don't need a test of cogency of belief. I don't think it's the business of courts to assess the veracity or cogency of claims made in the name of religious belief. And that, again, here I disagree with some other liberals who challenge the cogency of some claims put forward by religious believers. For example, there's been some recent criticism of claims about complicity. So some religious believers don't want to be complicit in the sins committed by others. And some have argued this is not this is not a cogent belief. So a pharmacist who doesn't want to sell contraceptives on the grounds that he or she doesn't want to be complicit in that sin is not properly engaging in a religious practice. I, again, don't take this view. I think whatever else you think about whether the exemption should go through, there's no doubt in my view that this can be a genuine religious belief. So integrity really is a subjective notion. It's a coherentist test. You need to look for a fit between what an agent, a person, thinks she should do and what she's able, in fact, to do. So it's not for courts to assess the cogency of her claim. Courts, I think, only have to check for basic sincerity and centrality of the belief to the life of the claimant. So much for the broad outlines of religious freedom as an individual right, which I think is grounded in moral or ethical integrity. Now, I want us to think about collective exemption rights and ask, are they similarly grounded? Are they also grounded in something like integrity? And how do we make sense of this? This is important because it's widely accepted that religious groups and churches, for example, have special rights of exemption from some general laws because of the burden that the laws, impose on their distinctively religious practices and traditions. For example, the Catholic Church is exempted from anti-discrimination laws when it selects its priests, so-called ministerial exception. So the question I'm interested in is, does something like integrity, so in this case collective integrity, also applies to groups, such that religious associations can have special rights of exemption? Okay, so I think they do, but I want to say a few things about the foundations and the limits of this claim. So I think they do. I argue at greater length in my forthcoming book that associations have two kinds of interests. They have two kinds of integrity-related interests, what I call interest in coherence and interest in competence. So interest in coherence are interests in being able to live according to their doctrine. That's a coherence interest. But they also have competence interest, which are interested in being able to interpret their own doctrine. And I think the combination of those two interests justify that sometimes exemptions from general laws are permissible. or even required. And one case here would be the male-only clergy in the Catholic Church. So let me say a bit more about coherence interests. So there are interests that associations have in sustaining their integrity, that is their ability to maintain a structure through which their members can pursue the purpose for which they have associated. And I take the view that this is derived from a freedom of association, a right of freedom of association. So individuals form associations to pursue the conception of the good they find valuable, and associations provide the structure within which this is possible. Now, religious associations, just like other associations, are entitled to enforce their standards on their members and to refuse association with non-adherence. So I think it would be a category mistake to complain that religious associations discriminate on religious grounds. And that's obviously a mistake that is not reflected in current law, which provides religious organizations with an exemption from discrimination on religious grounds. So if you think of coherence interests, I think they ground religious associations' right to prohibit apostasy or blasphemy for their members, also to excommunicate heretics and dissidents, and to refuse entry to non-believers. So I think a religious association that would be unable to insist on adherence to its own religious tenets as a condition of membership would be unable to be a religious association. Okay, now can a group rightfully invoke coherence interest to discriminate on otherwise impermissible grounds? So not religion, but grounds such as race, gender, or sexuality. So here I want to say that they can only when the professed doctrine of the group itself demands such differentiated treatment. So the thought here is that to be able to discriminate, a religious group must show the religious nature or basis of the practice. And this is a line that's been followed before the US Supreme Court constitutionalized the ministerial exemption. There were several cases where the court took the kind of line I'm defending here. For example, in a case involving unequal pay in a religious publishing house, Seventh-day Adventists were found guilty of discrimination against a female employee. And what the court said, preventing discrimination can have no significant impact upon the exercise of Adventist beliefs because the church proclaims that it does not believe in discrimination against women. Right? There is no doctrine that, according to which women should have different rights, therefore this practice was impermissible. So one implication of this line of thinking is that churches cannot discriminate on insidious grounds, by which I mean grounds that is not publicly committed to. Okay, but if a church tenets include some theologically justified exclusion, then I think it can invoke coherence interest to exempt itself or to seek an exemption from anti-discrimination legislation. I think for governments or judges to prevent groups from enforcing their own declared criteria of membership would be to strike at the heart of freedom of association. One case, I give you a UK case, quite a controversial case in the UK. The Jews free school, I think, shouldn't be forced to admit students that the school doesn't consider ethnically Jewish. So the school can set its own criteria of admission to the school. So by analogy, the government cannot force the Roman Catholic Church to ordain a female clergy so long as the church has a doctrine that demands male-only clergy. So when discrimination is grounded in this way, in an open and public doctrine, however objectionable the doctrine is, I think courts should treat it as a case of permissible religious discrimination, or discrimination on religious grounds. So I think freedom of association wouldn't be robust enough if we did not include this minimum associational integrity. The last question I want to raise, though, is how far does associational integrity extend? So in particular, should we apply to groups a permissive test of integrity, such that anything that group's leaders claim is central to the integrity of their association should give rise to special rights of exemption. For example, should for-profit, faith-infused associations exempt themselves from anti-discrimination labor laws? Or consider the now famous case of Burwell versus Hobby Lobby in 2014. So in that famous case, the court held that a closely held business association run by a religious family, the Green family, could be exempted from the contraception mandate imposed under authority of the 2010 Affordable Care Act. So because Hobby Lobby had a religious basis for its objection to providing insurance coverage for contraception, it was protected by the RFRA, by the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So the question I want to ask in closing is, does this family business, Hobby Lobby, do they have standing to claim a religious exemption to the contraception mandate? And I think not. And I want to argue that a business like Hobby Lobby doesn't exhibit the relevant integrity-related interest. You recall that integrity is a coherentist test. It requires a fit between an agent, what the agent is committed to, and what she's able to do. Now, in many cases of collective religious exemptions, the fit is there too, right? The Catholic Church, in the cases I've been using to illustrate my point here, is a relevant collective agent, is publicly committed to a doctrine of male clergy, and those to whom the doctrine applies can be assumed to be willing members of the church and to identify with its doctrines. And so because the church is an identificatory group, there is a tight fit between the agents, the representative agents, the acted upon agents, and the principles on which the demand is based. But of course, not all groups exhibit this kind of integrity, also I want to claim. And in particular, I think for-profit corporations can rarely make freedom of religion claims. And I want to explain why not. Thing is, I've lost sense of how much time I have left. Can I take another six minutes? Thank you. Okay, so I want to briefly run through 4 arguments that critics of Hobby Lobby have made to criticize the decision. And I don't think they're good arguments, so I want to give you a better one. So very briefly, arguments I think are not convincing, and they're quite common in the literature on this. The first argument that's made is something about complicity, which I referred to earlier, right? So the claim is the Green family, they don't want to be complicit in a sin committed by others. That's not really a genuine religious belief. So as I explained earlier, I don't think that's plausible. And the fact that we're talking about group right as opposed to an individual right, to me, is neither here nor there, because you're still talking about the beliefs of the Green family, of the members of that family. So I think that won't fly. Second argument, people claim because an exemption from the contraception mandate harms the women whose access to contraception is denied, it shouldn't be allowed on that ground. So that's the third-party harm claim. It's been made by people like Fred Geddix and others. So my response to this is, it can't be right that the mere fact that it harms women can be the reason for denying an exemption, because it really depends on the baseline you start from. Because you might think that women in the Catholic Church who are denied access to the priesthood are similarly harmed, in the sense that they're denied a benefit that you might think they ought to have access to. So you need an account of the difference between the two cases. And the Geddix kind of argument doesn't give us an explanation of the difference between the two cases. So for that reason, I don't think it works. Third argument, it's a legal argument about incorporation. So the fact that Hobby Lobby is a corporation should make a normative difference. Why? Because Formal incorporation implies that the corporation is a separate legal person, not simply an alter ego of the founders or the owners. And there's a corporate veil which protects shareholders from personal liability, but in turn, because of incorporation, they shouldn't be allowed to infuse the corporation with their personal beliefs and values. So this is the argument. I'm not convinced by that either, because I think as a general fact about corporations, it's just not true. The corporate form is not incompatible with the advancement of religion as the main purpose of a corporate entity. So many churches, synagogues, and mosques are corporate entities, and so legal incorporation in itself doesn't rule out collective freedom of religion claims. Fourth and last argument that I think doesn't quite work is a functional argument about the market, about market relations. Right? So here you want to distinguish between a church, which is an expressive association, and a for-profit business corporation, which is a commercial organization. And here the thought is, once you start operating in the market economy, your primary purpose is to maximize profit, and therefore then, if that's the case, you should be subjected to the state's compelling interest of fair access to material resources and opportunities. So the thought is that as soon as a group does business, so to say, it's not religious anymore, right? So commerce and religion don't mix, so to say. Again, I'm not convinced by that. It strikes me as a radically reductive argument, both about the marketplace and about religion. People engage in the market economy for a variety of purposes, including the pursuit of values, ethical investment, corporate social responsibility, trading in religious goods. Think of kosher or halal butchers or Bible sellers, and also the provision of faith-based services such as healthcare. So many religious associations do not simply seek to engage in standardly religious activities such as praying, preaching, teaching, or otherwise engaging in the rituals of the faith. They also want to foster a religiously integrated life for their members and to bear witness to the faith in civil society, etc. So I think it would be quite arbitrary to claim that a kosher supermarket or a Bible seller cannot make a religious freedom claim just because it is engaged in a commercial activity. So that's the reason why the fourth argument doesn't work either. So none of the existing explanations, I think, are satisfactory. So I want to look at a different interpretive criterion, and I find that in my theory of integrity. And that involves a normative argument about the mode of association itself. So what I call an identificatory association implies a coherence or an alignment between the purpose, the structure, the membership, and the public of the association. So only groups or associations that exhibit a tight coherence in this way have a claim for exemptions from general laws, regardless of whether they are incorporated or whether they are commercial in nature. This is because the natural persons that are involved in the workings of the collective entity, be they leaders, members, employees, or customers, are in the right relationship with the association, in the right identificatory relationship with the association. If that's the case, then I think the association is entitled to claim coherence as a key interest. Now, of course, in practice, most for-profit corporations do not exhibit the right kind of coherence, but some do as long as they meet the test. So paradigmatically, a church, a non-profit, solidaristic identificatory association has integrity-related interest, but it's less clear that a profit-based commercial organization such as Hobby Lobby can rightfully enforce the religious precepts of its owners on its non-adherent employees. So that's the key point. I'm going to close because I think I'm probably running out of time now. So the thought is that Hobby Lobby, despite the religious ethos of its owners and shareholders, is not an identificatory association because its 13,000 employees cannot be assumed to share the personal moral commitments of the shareholders and owners. Okay, so I just conclude by saying that only associations with integrity-related interests of the kind I've described have a pro tanto claim to exemptions. And you notice that it's not the presumptively religious nature of the association, but rather the mode of association that it actually exhibits that is relevant to its standing on this theory. So to conclude on the integrity theory of religious freedom, he makes the following three claims, just to sum up. So one, the notion of integrity gives an account of why certain commitments and practices deserve special concern in the form of special rights to exemption from general law. Second, integrity has different implications in individual and collective cases. So in individual cases, we can use a mostly subjective test. Whatever individuals think is central to their personal integrity is central to their personal integrity, provided the practices are central and important to that individual's life and she's sincere, then her being able to engage in those practices signals the coherentist fit that is at the core of the notion of integrity. But three, matters are slightly different in the case of groups. So agents who speak for a group can only engage the group's integrity if agents for whom the exemption is claimed are in the right kind of relationship, identificatory with the group. So this explains that although in my view Hobby Lobby shareholders have a sincere integrity-related claim individually, it is not sufficient to engage the integrity of their collective for-profit enterprise. Because Hobby Lobby employees do not mostly identify with the religious views of the shareholders, the enterprise has no integrity-related claim to be exempt from the contraception mandate. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
David Little.
Thanks, Ed. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been here before, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be back again and to share the podium with these distinguished panelists, Robert George and Cécile Laborde. I'm going to take a human rights approach to the general subject tonight, by which I mean that it is important to consider seriously the background, character, and underlying rationale of human rights language and law, and especially particular human rights documents and jurisprudence in discussing and debating the subject of religious freedom that's before us this evening. For one thing, it is the obligation of the United States to do so as a member of the United Nations. The preamble to the UN Charter talks of reaffirming faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, equal rights of men and women, and so on. So to be a member of the UN is already to have affirmed in some general way an obligation to espouse and live up to human rights obligations. For another, the U.S. ratified the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights in 1992, making it, according to Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, the supreme law of the land. Now, treaties like the International Covenant are not legally actionable without enabling legislation. Nevertheless, they do impose some binding requirements on participating governments, such as the obligation to demonstrate every 4 years how well the provisions of the covenant are being complied with by the member state. And finally, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, according to which the U.S. government evaluates the performance of governments around the world in regard to religious freedom standards, expressly invokes the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, as well as other international instruments in defining those standards, holding others accountable to standards that the U.S. does not apply to itself seems to me grossly hypocritical. There are therefore good reasons why the principles and teachings of international human rights help, as one author says, to confirm, refine, and prioritize prevailing First Amendment principles and cases in U.S. law. The implication is that when we take up, as I shall do presently, as Cécile has already done, the Hobby Lobby case, which concerns, as she has already made clear, exemptions for some commercial companies from insurance obligations imposed upon such companies under the Affordable Care Act, that when we take up cases like that, we do well to consider them in the light of the international human rights standards that I've alluded to. I should have mentioned that my strategy is hardly beyond challenge. There is these days a large and growing literature sharply skeptical of a human rights approach and the human right to religious freedom in particular. Well-placed critics from Harvard University to the University of Chicago regularly speak of the twilight of human rights law or of the vacuous and illusory character of human rights language. They speak also of the impossibility of religious freedom and of the extent to which advocates of religious freedom, including the U.S. government and what are described as fellow traveling experts and scholars, distort and manipulate the concepts and standards of religious freedom in favor of a distinctly Western and most particularly American view, Christian Protestant view of religious freedom. That way of doing things, they say, primarily serves to advance Western, and particularly American cultural and material biases and interests. Now, I disagree with what much of what the critics are saying, but I am sensitive to those criticisms in developing my argument. So I turn briefly to freedom of conscience, religion, or belief as a fundamental human right. Johannes Morsink has made clear in his definitive book, The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Origins, Drafting, and Intent, that human rights can be understood only against the background of fascist belief and practice. Human rights were explicitly designed as a set of legally enforceable rights and protections capable of preventing or reducing the exercise of arbitrary force associated with Hitler and his fascist colleagues. Arbitrary force, at a minimum, means the power to inflict death, impairment, severe pain or suffering, or material destruction for self-serving purposes or manifestly mistaken reasons. By Hitler's own testimony in Mein Kampf and elsewhere, all that matters is the leader's power to get his way. The objective is not to convince people by claims of truth and validity, but simply to get the submission of the follower by using whatever actions and utterances are deemed necessary to that end. His theory of propaganda, incidentally, in Mein Kampf is explicitly cynical in regard to appeals to truth and validity. Those are utterly beside the point. Simply appeal to a doctrine about which the broad masses, according to Adolf Hitler, do not understand anything. They are indifferent to the fact that the doctrine being put forward is essentially groundless. In fact, he uses a term very close to that. Hitler's ideology, if he had one, was absolute personal rule to use force as he saw fit. Judith Shklar, in her famous essay, The Liberalism of Fear, has called the inclination knowingly to perpetrate arbitrary, unexpected, unnecessary, and unlicensed acts of force in any regime as a summum malum, a supreme evil, which, she says, all of us know and would avoid if only we could. I suggest that it is that moral understanding that underlies human rights language and law, leaving no doubt as to what the drafters of the Universal Declaration had in mind when they stated in the preamble, disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of humankind. We should recall that Hitler rose to power on the strength of Article 48, the emergency article of the Weimar Constitution, effectively replacing it with the Führer principle or the leader principle. That resulted in the suspension of civil rights with almost no limit, authorizing Hitler to use police power according to his whim or pleasure to intimidate and suppress all opposition. In fact, it may be said that the whole human rights corpus was a response to a massive abuse by Hitler and other fascists of an appeal to public emergency. Think here of Article 4 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which imposes a set of non-derogable rights. Non-derogable rights are rights that may never be suspended under any conditions. That set of rights prohibits, even during times of emergency, discrimination, extrajudicial killing, torture, or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, enslavement, certain degrees of due process, and, please note, the freedom of conscience, religion, or belief. It is of the greatest importance, it seems to me, that Article 18 of the Universal Declaration and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, Article 18 is the freedom of conscience, religion, or belief, to use the terms that provision describes, is included among the non-derogable rights. A key feature of arbitrary force, as practiced by the Hitler regime, was the relentless imposition by force of a specific set of beliefs on everyone under its control, meaning the persecution of all religious and other expressions of dissent. Such actions were arbitrary because coercion is not a justification for believing in the truth or rightness of anything. Since conscience, religion, or belief involve at bottom basic convictions about truth and rightness, they are subject in traditional language to the law of the spirit, namely persuasive appeals to reason, emotion, and evidence, and not to the law of the sword. In other words, coercing belief is, from Judith Sklar's point of view, one of the manifestations of the summum malum. Trying to coerce belief is a fundamental mistake in human experience. The purpose of Article 18 is to protect anyone and everyone standing alone or in community against being told by government or others what they should hold dear. According to the Human Rights Committee, mandated to interpret and to administer the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, the terms of belief and religion are to be broadly construed. Article 18, it says, protects theistic, non-theistic, and atheistic beliefs, as well as the right not to profess any religion or belief. Moreover, it is not limited to traditional religions or beliefs with institutional characteristics. It rules out any tendency to discriminate against any religion or belief based on the fact that they are newly established or represent religious minorities. Also protected, the committee goes on, is the right to manifest religion or belief in observance and practice, which may include not only ceremonial acts, but also customs such as the observance of dietary regulations, the wearing of distinctive clothing or head coverings, participation in rituals associated with certain stages of life. In short, both beliefs and practices are fully protected under Article 18. Now, it is true, and this gets us closer to our subject of the evening, it is true that Article 18 does permit government to limit manifestation or overt practice of conscience, not to limit belief, but to limit practice. It clearly does that and places in doing that the burden of proof on the government. In imposing restrictions, the government must show that a restriction is prescribed by law, is necessary for protecting compelling state interests, which is what Professor George alluded to in general. These compelling state interests, according to Article 18, are defined as public safety, public health, public order, along with the rights of other people. It must be thus prescribed by law, necessary, and proportional, understood as imposing the least burden conceivable on conscience, religion, or belief to protect the compelling state interest in question. So the formulation in the jurisprudence of Article 18 of the International Covenant matches really perfectly the description of RFRA, or the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Four things are worth emphasizing about this provision. First, it implies an obligation of deference on the part of the government toward matters of conscience, religion, or belief. State interference in such matters can only be justified in the name of state interests that are truly necessary or clearly compelling, and all claims to that effect must be carefully proven. Second, the requirement that restrictions be proportional or the least burdensome suggests the possibility of conscientious exemption from all or part of a restriction imposed by government. Third, human rights jurisprudence actually provides a generic exemption of major importance that I want to come back to towards the end of my talk. Although Article 18, the committee says, does not explicitly refer to a right of conscientious objection to military service, the Human Rights Committee believes that such a right can be derived from it, inasmuch as the obligation to use lethal force may seriously conflict with the freedom of conscience and the right to manifest one's religion or belief. This, incidentally, is an astounding concession. As a matter of principle, it surrenders to conscience, religion, or belief the right to override perhaps the most fundamental attribute of government, namely the final authority to regulate lethal force. Fourth, the intention of Article 18 is not to privatize religion, as critics frequently allege. On the contrary, by implying an obligation of governmental deference, claims of conscientious exemption have a decisive public effect by helping precisely to define the limits of governmental authority. So it's a fundamentally public activity, this matter of exempting for religious and conscientious objections. It's helping to define where the state may go and where it may not go. I myself am convinced that arbitrary force, including coerced belief, as practiced by the mid-20th century fascists, has to a greater or lesser degree been practiced by all authoritarians, is indeed a summum malum in any regime, as Sklar says. Her claim is clearly universal in intent, and it implies in a compelling way of justifying the freedom of conscience, religion, or belief as a fundamental human right. In other words, arbitrary force is wrong in itself, and when applied to conscience, religion, or belief is equally a fundamental evil. That right guarantees freedom from coerced belief for everyone, everywhere, along, of course, with human rights protections against other forms of arbitrary treatment. As a moral matter, I do not see for myself how it is possible to doubt such a conclusion. Now I turn briefly to American law and pick up on the Burwell and take a somewhat different view of the matter from Cécile. Conflicting opinions in American debates over religious freedom, intense and heated as they are, appear, generally speaking, to fall into two camps. On the left, if we may put it this way, there is deep suspicion of the desire to single out religious belief for special exemption, since that supposedly extends unfair advantages to religious people over non-religious people, and is likely to favor religious special interests over the public good. On the right, it is held that religious belief and practice are under severe threat from an increasingly secular society and government, and that there exists distressingly a concerted campaign to reduce, if not eliminate altogether, religious influence from the public sector. The controversy surrounding Burwell v. Hobby Lobby is a good example of this division of opinion. The case, as we've heard, was decided by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision in favor of the plaintiff, the Hobby Lobby Company, as we know, a arts and crafts commercial group corporation with 500 stores and 13,000 employees, and it's owned and operated by the Green family, Protestant evangelicals committed to conducting their business according to Christian convictions. One of those convictions is that engaging in or supplying to others emergency contraception, namely birth control measures that prevent pregnancy after sex, thus amounting to a form of abortion, is seriously immoral. Under the Affordable Care Act, employment-based group health care plans must provide reproductive care, including FDA-approved contraceptive measures, some of which are abortifacients or abortion-inducing agents. The Greens sued the Health and Human Services Department, seeking relief from substantial tax penalties for not complying with the ACA regulations. They defended themselves by contending that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act exempts for-profit companies from providing its employees contraception coverage because of the religious objections of the owners. Writing for the majority, Justice Alito claimed that Congress intended that RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, applies not just to religious and religiously oriented nonprofit corporations, but also to closely held owner-operated for-profit corporations like Hobby Lobby. Justice Alito continues, the requirement mandated by the ACA that the owners either fund measures they believe wantonly kill babies or pay significant fines imposes a very substantial burden on them that is not the least restrictive means for satisfying a legitimate and compelling interest the government has, namely providing, supplying free contraceptive coverage for employees. A less restrictive means that should be applied in this case, according to Justice Alito, is to exempt Hobby Lobby from paying the cost of contraception coverage and to require that the insurance company make up the cost with no additional expense to the employees. By the way, the argument is that the insurance company will actually reduce its costs by providing that reproductive health contraception coverage because it will prevent unwanted births and some of the medical implications that will follow, it is argued, if these reproductive devices are not made available to women. Reactions on the left are sharply critical of the ruling, and they're well summarized in Justice Ginsburg's lengthy dissent. For her, RFRA does not apply to for-profit corporations, I think somewhat along the lines that Cécile was arguing. Even if it did, the government's compelling interest in protecting women's reproductive health readily overrides the religious interests of the Greens. Justice Ginsburg also thinks the ruling, by opening the door to religious exemptions in the marketplace, ignores the unfair and injurious effects such exemptions are likely to have on employees for other for-profit corporations who do not share the owner's religious beliefs. Reactions on the right have generally been favorable to the ruling for upholding the rights of religious freedom against the perceived onslaught of secular domination, though there are some exceptions that I won't go into right now. In the light of the human rights approach I introduced earlier, I tend to agree in general, and thus differ to some degree with Cécile Laborde, with the Hobby Lobby ruling. The ruling, in my opinion, properly affirms the general obligation of governmental deference to conscience, religion, or belief, and does it in a way consistent with the requirements embodied in Article 18 of the International Covenant, that any limitation on conscience, religion, or belief be prescribed by law, be necessary for protecting compelling government interests, and be proportional, understood as imposing the least burdensome means available to protect the state interests in question. In addition, the ruling does two more things. By extending religious freedom by extending religious freedom to the marketplace, into the commercial area, it affirms within limits the comprehensive public scope of the obligation of governmental deference to conscience, religion, or belief. And with a little work, Justice Alito's majority opinion can be revised to heed what I described earlier as the generic exemption of major importance, namely a principled right not to be compelled against conscience to inflict lethal force. In my judgment, RFRA, which is the prescribed law of the land in this case, is fully relevant to the Hobby Lobby decision. Its central provisions that government may substantially burden a person's exercise of religion only if it demonstrates that the burden is one, advances a compelling governmental interest, and two, is the least restrictive means of doing that, is completely consistent with Article 18 of the ICCPR mentioned earlier. There is strong evidence in the legislative history of RFRA that it was intended to cover for-profit corporations, and the Supreme Court has never said that religious freedom claims are irrelevant to commercial life. I also believe that it is a distortion, and I think Cécile agrees with this, to characterize profit-making as entirely indifferent to moral and religious matters. Two conditions apparent in the Hobby Lobby ruling serve to guarantee religious interests will not come to dominate the marketplace. One is RFRA's requirement that conscientious exemptions be balanced against compelling governmental interests. The other is the restriction of religious exemptions to closely held owner-operated corporations. Lastly, something special about the Greens' beliefs must be mentioned. The subject of substantial burden is not limited, I think, to the size of the penalty applied to the Greens if they fail to pay for coverage. That's what Justice Alito alleged. Substantial burden, I believe, also involves consideration of the nature of the plaintiff's belief against paying to kill babies. As one scholar says, the government's demand in this sense to pay for killing is unprecedented. We have never in our national history refused exemptions to conscientious objectors who refuse to kill. This observation connects to the point I made earlier about the principled exemption in Article 18, exempting those who refuse to kill. There is, in short, a special weight, it seems to me, to the religious objections in this case. Well, in conclusion, I've argued that a human rights approach to the subject of religious freedom provides a persuasive framework for grounding and illuminating the meaning of religious freedom. I tried to make that case by suggesting briefly the application of the framework to the Burwell v. Hobby Lobby case. Thanks very much.